Hello and welcome to Amagi, co-hosted by myself, Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube, and Nima of economicsjunkie.com. We are here to tackle ideas, both ancient and modern, in an effort to bring you the tools needed to expand the power of your worldview, making you a more potent entity, professionally, politically, philosophically, or otherwise. We are graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. And this is going to be episode 31, Investment Perspectives on MMT. So Nima was digging around the internet looking for articles related to money and MMT, as he usually does, and brought them to the fore so we can dissect them, and it's looking like we got a pretty good one here. And this is from the website Benny, do I have this right? BennyLongFunds.com, BENNE, longfunds.com. And I guess this is Quay Global Investors, and these are investment perspectives, modern monetary theory, and why you're about to hear a lot more about it. So, Nima, before I start reading, was there anything that you wanted to say to get us ready for this? I haven't read this article yet. Nima threw it at me, and I'm going to go over this fresh.
No, just I think it's always good to hear about modern money theory from people who actually have to do money all day, every day, and their life depends on it.
Where did you get this bizarre idea?
I know, it's crazy, but why not? Why not have a look?
I'm pretty sure the best way to understand money is to listen from people who went to school for 8 years and got in debt for their entire lives and work at a very low-wage job in order to pay that infinite debt off. Those are the people we need to learn money from.
Yeah, I think you'll probably learn more from Plato about money than from those people.
I was just listening to Stefan Molyneux's The Truth About Plato today.
Yeah, I haven't checked that one out yet.
Anyway, so unless you got something you want to add, I'm going to jump right into this article.
Yeah, go for it.
Awesome. So this, no author on the top, so well, I guess we might find out who wrote it at the bottom. If you're paying attention to U.S. politics, you may be aware of an emerging new economic theory supported by many U.S. Democrats, including Congress, in quotes, freshman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. This economic framework is generally known as a modern monetary theory, or MMT. There have been a number of hot takes from economists and journalists on the topic over the past couple of months, suggesting that it is dangerous. ECB. Do you know who ECB is?
European Central Bank.
Oh, that's what I thought too. Maybe he's including that in the list of economists, which I would totally believe the European Central Bank calling MMT dangerous. Well, yeah, that's the last thing they want people knowing.
Yeah, I think they have an issue with the Italian government, because the Italian government apparently totally understands MMT. And so they understand that the ECB and the European Monetary Union is a bunch of bullshit. So it makes sense that the ECB would have an issue.
Garbage by Larry Fink, Nothing New by Paul Krugman, or Valuable by Paul McCulley. I was first introduced to MMT 10 years ago when I stumbled on a blog by Bill Mitchell. As a finance professional, I was somewhat dismayed that the financial crisis took me and my colleagues by surprise. How did I miss it, and how could I recognize the signs if it were to happen again? Since 2009, I have read hundreds of articles, thanks to Bill Mitchell, academic papers, and books on the topic. The purpose of this article... Whoa, wait. So, this guy actually read books and articles on the topic before writing an article about it?
Yeah, it's a total hack, right?
I've never seen this before. I have never, ever seen this before. This is going to be a wild ride, Nima.
Yeah, that's what a total shill would do, right?
Total shill. Only an alt-right extremist would do something. This is white supremacy we're looking at right here. Pure and simple. Anyway, the purpose of this article is to provide you with a more balanced, that is to say, market-based perspective of MMT, and why you'll hear a lot more about it in the next few years. Zing. MMT is extremely detailed and has a deep history, so I'll cover the topic in over 2 parts. This month, I will discuss MMT and the role of government. And the first part of this is MMT is not a policy. In our opinion, the biggest weakness of MMT is the name. With the T meaning theory, the uninitiated expect MMT to be an unproven concept or policy, or something that could be tried with unknown consequences. But MMT is as much of a theory as a theory of gravity. That is, MMT is fact-based, empirically supported framework of the modern, that is, post-gold standard era monetary system. I've mentioned this before in previous podcasts. It's nothing to do with MMT, but about the word theory. Colloquially, people have taken the word theory to simply mean opinion or idea. And as this guy points out, theory, in the, I guess we'll call it the correct sense, is something that you use when you're talking about, say, gravity. The theory of gravity, where there is a lot of evidence to support it, despite the fact that it's not proven. So, a theory isn't just some idea that you came up with. I mean, that's not even a hypothesis, because a hypothesis requires an observation at first. A theory is something where you've really got a lot of evidence and work behind it to say, okay, I have something to support this. I
still don't understand why it's a problem that MMT has a theory in it.
I get his point.
He doesn't like that it doesn't sound overly definitive, but I'm just fine with the theory.
And I am too, and I think the error isn't that it says theory. I think the error is most people don't know what theory means. This guy. Anyway, at its core...
I mean, we've discussed what issues we have with the name, like
Modern.
It's not really that modern. It's just recognizes theories that have been around for thousands and thousands of years.
And in fact, let's make a little criticism here. This last sentence I just wrote. MMT is a fact-based, empirically supported framework of the modern, that is to say, post-gold standard era monetary system. Even here's a little bit of error. It explains.
I don't necessarily agree with that either, because the gold standard system is also perfectly explained by MMT and MMT literature and the framework behind it.
But we could overlook this because we haven't actually talked about any of the dynamics of what MMT or MMT isn't yet. So let's see how he does. At its core, MMT is a framework and detailed description on how the monetary system actually works across most developed countries. If you're reading this in Australia, the US, UK, Canada, Japan, or New Zealand, and a few more countries, and congratulations, you are already living in a world of MMT. Yes, even you, Jerome Powell. Yeah, see, he's close, but he's not quite hitting it. Because MMT describes all of them just fine. It's just in these particular countries, they're a sovereign issuer of their own currency. So MMT says, okay, you can expect these certain attributes to be observable in these economies. So if MMT is nothing more than a description of the system, how is it different to mainstream economics? So next part is distinguishing between a currency issuer and the currency user. In 2011, the poster child of mainstream economic thought, Paul Krugman, pause for a second. Is there any fucking economist on the planet who likes Paul Krugman? Like, the MMTers and the Austrians hate him equally.
Everyone just shits all over him.
And I think he deserves it, because I get the sneaking suspicion that he gets paid a whole hell of a lot of money to just repeat whatever the local propaganda or the current propaganda is and give it a economic-y flavor to it. So he's just another talking head. It's like, oh, here's our expert economist with economics words telling us why we're right. That's what I think his job is. But it's just a theory. Paul Krugman famously asked why there was such a difference between Japanese and Italian interest rates. He noted Japan's government debt dwarfed that of Italy, yet Japanese interest rates were always zero, while Italy and most of Europe was suffering from a sovereign debt crisis. MMT academics knew the answer years earlier. Since its formation in the early 1990s, MMT recognized the difference between currency issuers and currency users. Currency issuers include the governments of the United States, Japan, Australia, UK, and Canada. Currency users include Italy, Portugal, Greece, households, businesses, state and local governments, etc. MMT recognizes countries that issue their own currency cannot inadvertently become insolvent. Of course, that does not mean they will never go broke, but insolvency is a political choice, not economic. For example, the debt ceiling in the USA is a political constraint, not an economic constraint. However, a country like Italy is no different from a household. Like a household, Italy does not have its own currency issuing central bank, and therefore it can go broke. It was this insight that many MMT scholars accurately predicted the inevitable euro crisis almost 10 years before it happened. Yup, we talked about this more than once. On the other hand, currency issuing governments like Australia, Japan, the UK, or the USA are never financially constrained. Whether Australia's deficit is 10 billion or 100 billion, the debt will never force interest rates higher or condemn Australia to an economy similar to Greece. There will always be a buyer of its bonds. To be clear, it is only the federal government, in concert with the central bank, that has currency issuing powers. In Australia, state and local governments are currency issuers, and as such are required to balance their budgets over time to the extent that the federal government doesn't fund state or local projects. So essentially, if they get a federal grant, that's great, but otherwise they have to balance their budget. I guess unless you're California, does California get its budget balanced, or what's up with that?
Well, I mean, every state has to get their budget balanced as per the state's constitutions, but some states, they can miss their budget goals and then borrow, and that applies in California, from what I understand. So yeah, I mean, but they also have some solid income taxes on their people, so they make up for the spending accordingly.
Yeah, how's that going? You got crazy sales taxes, crazy income taxes.
Yeah, income tax is the top marginal
in the country.
State income tax in the country.
And what's your sales tax at?
Sales tax is somewhere usually around 9% or so. I mean, I guess there's a city and county component, but it's always somewhere around 9.5, maybe even 10% at this point out here in San Francisco.
That always blows my mind, because in Washington we have a really high sales tax. It's near 10%, but there's no personal income tax.
Yeah, it's almost like the money just disappears in a giant black hole of nothingness.
Oh man, strange.
By the way, what he points out here is important from a money manager's perspective, because if you understand MMT, you understand why interest rates are so low in countries like Japan and Australia. I don't know about Australia and UK. In Europe, it's obviously very low. But then in Europe, you have the problem that the individual governments don't have sovereignty. So the only country that really follows the risk-free rate without any additional premium is Germany, I believe. I guess that's probably not true. Probably Germany, Austria, maybe Switzerland too. But Switzerland has its own central bank. So anyway, but for example, here I have a tweet from Peter Schiff from September 19th, 2018. The yield on the 30-year U.S. Treasury bond just hit a new 4-year high today. So far, stock market investors don't seem to care. That means yields will keep rising until they do. Given that 3.24% is still extremely low, yields have a long way to rise and will do so quickly. The definitive language is always
right. So
interesting.
So Peter Schiff, just so we could translate that a little bit.
This was Austrian economist, September 19th, 2018, 3.24%. Is where the yields were at the time, and it's extremely low. He's saying and now they're at 2.9%, and
right, and
this will have a long way to go. Rise and will do so quickly. Well, that didn't really happen.
Well, and his error, of course, is that he's attributing a market force to bond yields. That it has something to do with the market, where the government needs money and it needs to attract that money by raising the bond yields. And if people are investing in the stock market, well, that means they're not interested in government bonds. So the government is going to have to raise the yield in order to attract those people away from the stocks to the government bonds. Well, the government doesn't need any of that shit. That's just all incorrect.
It's all Fed policy in countries like the U.S., Japan, where you have a sovereign government and the currency is floating. Then it's all based on Fed policy and the market's expectations on Fed policy. So that's all you need to look out for. And this guy that we're reading right now, he probably understands that, and Peter Schiff not so much. So here's an example of how MMT can help you make better decisions and give better advice if you are an investment professional.
And then before I go on, I think the main question that he raised here was right at the beginning, or I guess Paul Krugman noted this, is why has Japan been doing fine at a near zero interest rate, while Italy and the rest of of Europe has been doing horrible?
Yeah, also you got to give Krugman credit for pondering that question.
Well, I think he's smart. I think he gets it. In fact, did you see that post from Warren Mosler a couple weeks ago on Facebook, where I guess Paul and Warren sat down to dinner one night, I believe on the U.S. Virgin Islands where Warren lives.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow.
And Warren told him everything, and Paul Krugman totally got it. Paul Krugman completely 100% got it, which, again, reinforces my theory that he's a paid shill. He just says whatever needs to be said in order to promulgate the
but I also read recently somewhere that Paul Krugman has become much more accepting of MMT in his recent writings even. So I don't know. I haven't seen it, but I definitely saw someone write that, and it's curious that kind of coincides with that meeting that you described there with Warren Mosler. So, maybe Warren really taught him some just absolutely mind-blowing things.
So, moving on. And I wanted to bring up the issue comparing Japan and Italy, despite the fact that they had the same interest rates, that they had completely different economic situations. A person might say, hey, maybe the interest rate isn't the thing controlling the economic situation. So the article goes on to say deficits do matter, just not the way you think. Recognizing that money is not a constraint for government, many critics jump to the conclusion that adherents of MMT, known informally as MMTers, believe deficits do not matter. Kind of like the fucking articles that we've been reading before this. What's that?
Yeah, go ahead.
And therefore, the entire framework is garbage. Yet there are many papers over the years where MMT academics clearly acknowledge deficits have always mattered, just not the way people traditionally think.
Yeah, I'd say actually MMTers think much more about deficits, ironically. Because everyone always says MMTers say deficits don't matter and they don't care about deficits. I actually think MMTers think a lot more and care a lot more about deficits than everyone else.
MMTers are like deficit is the number one issue. Everything else is a derivative of that.
Well, and also the deficit is a complex issue, so let's understand it.
Mm-hmm.
Before talking about it.
Right, and it's more complex than, oh my God, we owe too much money. What are we going to do? We can't pay it back, so we all going to die.
Exactly.
The MMT framework...
Oh, by the way, did you know that... Social Security is running out of money in like 16 years.
Oh, yeah. Hasn't that been the case for every 16 years?
Well, but I think it's interesting because it's 4 years after the world ends, according to global warming doomsday cultists. So that's fine, I guess, right? I mean, what do we need Social Security for if the world has ended.
Well, I mean, if the environmentalists have their way, they'll end it for us. So, yeah. Moving on. The MMT framework understands that while money may buy any good or service in an economy, it does not guarantee that a good or service will be available. That is, the constraint on unlimited net government spending is not financial, but the availability of real resources in the economy. And while in a country like Australia or the US can never run out of its own currency, it can run out of labor, energy, food, or water. Put another way, the real budget constraint is inflation. But MMTers don't care about inflation, Nima.
Right.
Well, some of them might not. The Cortezes of the world. Or the people telling her what to say. Deficits create the money that ultimately buys the bonds. So mainstream economic literature says that governments can only spend from revenue raised. Revenue raised being from taxes and from selling bonds. The insight from MMT is that spending comes first, only to be taxed later. That is, tax dollars do not fund government spending, but government spending funds tax dollars. Some critics misinterpret this concept into believing that by not requiring taxes to fund the budget, MMTers advocating that governments simply force their own central bank to fund the spending directly. Yes, it's like he read those other articles we've been reading in previous episodes. They argue this risks the independence of central banks, turning them into political tools and discrediting their role in the economy, causing foreign investors to flee and thus rendering the local currency worthless. Such a criticism generally reflects a poor understanding of how the Treasury, central bank, commercial banks, and bond issuance interact on a daily basis. In Australia, this guy must be Australian. In Australia, the central bank already assists in funding the government and has been doing so for decades. This is due to the institutional, regulatory, and policy framework of the Australian financial system. The step-by-step process of this relationship is technical and requires an understanding of bank reserve accounting, but for those interested, we have outlined it in the attachment. Bleh. I like how he points out that this relationship is technical and requires an understanding of bank reserve accounting, which is literally...
It's probably exactly the same as our situation here, and we've gone through that
with
accounting.
Warren Mosler himself.
Exactly.
I just wanted to bring that up, is that if you aren't able to understand what's going on in these technical situations involving bank reserve accounting, it may look like the government needs to raise money, or it may look like that the government's running out of money, or it needs to raise the interest on these bonds in order to get money. But if you're able to zoom out and look at the whole thing as a whole, you can see that that's not the case.
Yeah, if you net it all out, if you net out all the individual pieces, the government selling the bonds, the Federal Reserve buying the bonds, the reserves appearing here and there, if you cancel that all out, you end up with a mechanism where the government spends money into existence, taxes it out of existence, offers bonds for people who want to buy them with the remainder that remains in the system.
Going on. The implication is that government spending does not crowd out the private sector, which is believed to force up interest rates. Not convinced? The data below shows U.S. interest rates continue to fall despite higher levels of government debt. And below here we have a... Oh, by the way, the link to this article will be in the description below. We have a graph of... Looks like a 10-year Treasury constant maturity rate graphed alongside the federal debt from, looks like, about 1980 to today.
And it's a debt to GDP, debt percentage of GDP.
So as the graph is very clear. The federal debt goes up while the 10-year Treasury goes down. Yep. When confronted with such data, critics often suggest that the USA is different, as the US dollar is the world's reserve currency. But
by the way, see the source there for that image?
Pragmatic capitalism.
Just want to plug that. All right, go on.
So when confronted with such data, critics often suggest the USA is different, as the US dollar is the world's reserve currency. Aha, but this guy's Australian. But if that's true, why do we have the same dynamic in Japan, the UK, and even Australia? So he shows a similar graph for the Australian government debt to GDP versus the 10-year bond yield. And it's the same thing.
Yeah.
I was just looking at what the 10-year yield was in Australia. I guess it's about the same here, about 3%. The recognition that spending comes first has profound implications. It means net government spending creates a net non-government surplus, or financial assets inclusive of bonds. That is, net government deficits is equal to household savings plus company savings plus foreign savings. This can be empirically shown via the sectoral balances over time. We did an entire show on sectoral balances way back at the beginning. Go check it out. The chart below shows the balances for the USA from 1952 to 2015. Although the data aggregates the household sector and the business sector as the domestic private sector. And so this is literally the graph that converted me to MMT.
Huh.
I saw a lecture by Warren Mosler, and honestly, I didn't even watch the whole thing. I was just clicking around through it, and I happened to click on him pointing at this graph. And this is a graph of the financial sector balances as a percent of GDP for the government sector, the domestic private sector, and the foreign sector. And it's zero in the middle, and then you have positive percentages up and negative percentages down. And
without foreign trade, your government's budget deficit is precisely equal to your private sector's budget surplus.
Yeah. And then
also known as net private saving.
And Warren said something like the reason that the domestic private sector money goes down when the government sector goes down is because there's no other place for the money to come from. I mean, asterisk the foreign sector, but again, leave that out for now. That's a slightly different conversation. Is that the money has to come from the government in order for the private sector to have it in the first place, and that was my total aha moment. Like, oh my god, what? Exactly. You mean it wasn't barter that the government comes and steals, and that's where they get the money from? Nope, it is not that. Moving on. Regular readers will recognize the chart above, and we have also published the Australian sectoral balances in webinars and other presentations. Below are the 4 Australian sectoral balances since 1998. And I will...
Same idea, basically.
Yeah, we'll let you peruse those on your own time. The fact that the government is moving closer to a surplus at the same time household savings approach zero is not a coincidence. It's accounting. If the government wants household savings to increase, it must run a larger deficit.
Now, just to add here, it's not really household savings, but it's the private sector's net savings. So the private sector can also generate savings when a bank makes a loan, because that money also ends up in private sector bank accounts. But on the net, the private sector's position doesn't change. However, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with generating savings through a bank loan origination. However, the problem is that it can go too far when the private sector goes into too much bank debt. in other words, when too much of the money is generated through bank loan origination rather than through government deficits or export surpluses, then the private sector's financial position becomes unstable, and at one point a recession occurs. So that's why it's relevant, and that's why these numbers are relevant.
Absolutely. MMT and the role of taxation. If Australia is not fiscally constrained, but resource constrained, why are our schools and hospitals underfunded? Why do we actually have any unemployment? What is the role of charity? And why do I have to pay taxes if they don't actually fund the government? I'm still asking myself that question. I know the answer, but you know what I mean. Trust me, during my 10-year journey understanding this framework, I asked myself the same questions. Yet under MMT, taxes play a vital role in the economy, but not for financing the government. Taxes serve two purposes. Number one, they reduce the purchasing power of the private sector, which frees up resources in the economy so the government can purchase goods and services in a non-inflationary way to meet its social and political objectives. For example, this may include ensuring that there is enough labor for a standing army, judicial system, and schools. Number two, they give the currency value. I would have put that as number one and the other one as number two, but whatever. Critics of fiat currencies, like the US or Australian dollar, argue that since going off the gold standard, there is nothing supporting the value of the modern currency other than good faith. If that faith ever vanished, which some suggest is inevitable, Peter Schiff. If I say his name 3 times, will he appear and predict the doom of the economy?
Yeah, better don't.
If that faith ever vanished, the value of the currency would be destroyed. Hence, hard money advocates suggest gold is the only true form of money and will always be a store of value. And more recently, cryptocurrency advocates offer the same argument. I'm not sure if they offer the same argument, but yeah, gold is the only true form of money.
We've talked about cryptocurrency, and we have a slightly different perspective. We don't look at cryptocurrency as a commodity like gold, but we look at it as a money system, and if another money system that confirms the validity of MMT, if anything.
Yeah.
But yeah, more about that in our episode on cryptocurrencies.
Yep, go back and listen to it.
Go back and listen to it.
From an MMT perspective, requirement for citizens to pay taxes creates demand and therefore an intrinsic value for the currency. For example, try to pay your taxes at the ATO. I'm guessing that's the Australian
Tax Office.
Yeah. Oh, there it is. With gold, and your payment will be rejected. The ATO will only ever accept Australian dollars to satisfy any tax liability. Alternatively, try not paying your taxes at all, and you will end up in jail. The price of engaging the Australian economy is the requirement to pay tax. There are historic precedents that support this notion of tax-creating demand for fiat currency from diverse periods, including the colony of Massachusetts in the late 17th century, the British colonies of Africa in the 1800s. Oh, those are the only two. Most failures of the system generally stemmed from overspending or weak taxation collection systems, i.e. deficits do matter. Well, this was the case in both the Revolutionary America and Confederate America that lacked general taxing authorities for the money that they were printing.
Right, and it is also true that the earliest colonies in the U.S. spent money into existence and taxed it out of existence later on.
Yep, and
it's the first money wave in the U.S.
From what I understand, Pennsylvania was the most clear-cut example of that.
Yeah, actually, I wrote an article on that, or I just copy-pasted some pieces from the corresponding Wikipedia page, and I was just looking for it, but it's a little while back. But in a nutshell, basically, I don't know which colony it was, but there was some colony. Because I was going into, because people were saying, well, but the U.S. started on a gold standard. I think it was the argument that
Bob Murphy made. Goddamn.
Yeah. At some point, U.S. started on a gold standard.
He had with me.
And the fiat money is just sort of an outlier, it's an aberration. But if you look at the history of the U.S., the first money system was a fiat money system. Just as the first money system that we're aware of in the whole world, in the whole Western civilization, was a fiat money system. So the reality is the standard system is a fiat money system with intermediate interruptions of gold standard experiments and silver experiments and the like.
Something that just came back to my mind, and I believe it was Thomas Paine's Common Sense, when he I can't remember if he was arguing for war or he was arguing why the United States is, North America is such a great place. And one of the points that he brought up was the fact that due to the fact that the colonies don't have a significant natural store or deposit of gold and silver, the authorities in Europe aren't going to be interested in plunder in the same way that they have been in other areas of the world. So yeah, it's not like the Spaniards were going to Virginia to dig up all the gold. Moving on. From an MMT perspective, the role of tax in the strict manner in which it is collected gives rise to underlying demand for the currency. Yes. Next part. Does MMT equal Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Weimar Republic? Nima? No, it doesn't. MMT critics are quick to try and draw parallels to economies that succumb to hyperinflation, Peter Schiff, suggesting this is a result of implementing MMT, which we know is not something that can be implemented because it's just a description, Peter Schiff. Understanding the role of inflation is central to the MMT framework. In fact, MMT was one of the very few schools of thought that correctly predicted quantitative easing would not cause inflation. Gasp. But the government just keeps printing money, Nima. They call it quantitative easing, and at any moment, like any tick of your pocket watch, the hyperinflation is going to happen due to the quantitative easing. Nima, did I lose you? Nima? Now I gotta text his ass.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Oh, okay.
Maybe
I was on mute?
You must have been.
Oh, damn. All right.
Were you giving funny commentary that I wasn't responding to?
No, you just said, Nima. So where we leave off?
What were you hearing everything I was reading?
Yeah.
Okay, so I was making fun of Peter Schiff a lot, and then I asked you, maybe we'll even keep this in the recording. Kind of funny. So the author here says, okay, in fact, MMT was one of the very few schools of thought that correctly predicted quantitative easing would not cause inflation. And I was making a joke about how hyperinflation is going to happen any second.
Right.
Because they're just printing money by quantitative easing. They're on quantitative easing number 7, and they're just kicking the can down the road, and it's going to happen any second. Everything's going to crash.
Right, because quantitative easing is just a private sector asset swap. So somebody holds a bond, they replace the bond with cash. What matters is where are they? What are they doing with those savings? Those are just savings they're sitting in a pension fund or retirement account, etc. And if they're replaced with cash, then chances are the buyer is probably just going to buy the next available interest-bearing securities or whatever. So it's just a private sector asset swap. Doesn't lead to more purchasing power. I mean, it doesn't cause inflation, and so the doomsday predictions are inaccurate.
Sad. And as we have noted, deficits do matter from an MMT perspective, since too much spending crowds out real resources in the economy, resulting in price inflation. Furthermore, the economic history of hyperinflation rarely begins in an economy operating at full employment. More often than not, hyperinflation is the result of a collapse of the productivity of the economy. I think it's not just more often than not, it's every time.
Yeah.
Can you think of an example where that wasn't the case?
Where what wasn't the case?
Where hyperinflation isn't the result of the collapse of the productive capacity of the economy.
Well, yeah, maybe in the continental U.S. where lack of taxation authority caused the hyperinflation.
But was it really hyperinflation?
I believe so, yeah.
Like, it went from, $1 had the same purchasing power as $1 billion the same the year later?
I believe so, yeah. Okay. I think there's a saying, not worth a continental. I think it's because the continental dollar wasn't worth anything anymore at one point.
Got it. Okay, well, there's my outlier. MMT and economic policy. MMT is nothing more than an accurate description of how the monetary system works. To summarize, there is a difference between a currency issuer and a currency user. A currency issuer, like Australia, USA, Japan, etc., can never inadvertently become insolvent. There are no financial constraints for the federal government. The constraints on a government is the availability of real resources in the economy and therefore inflation. Therefore, deficits do matter. Taxation does not fund the government. Net government spending has to occur before it can be taxed. However, taxation plays a critical role in the modern economy. A robust and enforceable tax regime gives a rise to intrinsic demand for the currency. What the hell is a robust tax regime?
A big one.
I guess it just ruffled my feathers the wrong way. Still not, even though my MMT guy doesn't mean I like taxes. Upon recognizing these realities, many policy ideas may arise. Recently, U.S. Democrat presidential hopefuls have been advocating policies such as the Green New Deal, Medicare for All, or free college tuition. From an MMT perspective, these proposals are clearly fundable in the same way the recent $1.5 trillion tax cut passed by Congress late in 2017 was funded. We note U.S. Treasury rates have since declined despite the sharp rise in bond issuance. That's because more people have cash sitting in the bank that they might as well earn some interest rates on, right?
Well, or the two just aren't related at all.
Could be that. MMT understands that ambitious policy ideas are only ever about whether there are enough real resources in the economy to meet these goals. For example, is the labor and technology available to transition the U.S. economy to renewable energy over 10 years? Are there enough hospitals, nurses, and doctors to provide the medical services needed to meet the needs of 330 million people? Do universities have enough lecture halls and teachers to cope with an increase in student demand? It's never how, in quotes, we pay for it. MMT and why you're about to hear...
By the way, I do think we definitely have enough lecture halls and teachers.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And we have enough lectures.
Yeah.
Period.
Well, if we turned all those teachers into vocational teachers, I think we might have something to work with.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think how many generations of English teachers who teach English students who become English teachers can you go through before the inbreeding is incapable of producing another generation of life forms?
Or any innovation. of any kind.
Yeah. Well, I think we've passed the innovation part. Have you ever heard of an English major who wrote anything useful these days?
Right. I mean, or any expert who's invented something significant in his field, for that matter.
That's an interesting point. John Taylor Gatto brings this up in the Ultimate History lesson, is that typically innovation comes from somebody outside the field.
Exactly.
Because they're able to come into the other field thinking about things a different way, which allows them to innovate.
Right, or Carroll Quigley, he also writes about it in Evolution of Civilizations, either, or Tragedy and Hope, where he says that basically everything is too important
for experts
to entrust it to experts, because experts become institutionalized, and experts start caring more than anything about their own status and their institution's status and money and prestige. And you see that today, I mean,
see it in anything. You just see it in anything.
Look at the climate doomsday cult. They've become a giant PR stunt that never ends, and they have to have conferences in the best cities. There was just when I walked by in San Francisco again, they have to have these giant fancy international summits where they burn more energy than an entire city would in an entire year. So what have these people produced of significance?
Well, the exact opposite of what the original idea was.
Yeah. I mean, what if they produced other than tantrums and freakouts and bad predictions?
Well, if we're going to combine this with teachers and professors, I remember when I was taking some of my chemistry classes in college, I had to sit there and listen to one of my professors go on about Al Gore's The Inconvenient Truth, and how it was our responsibility as the next generations of chemists to solve this problem of energy and the global warming crap.
Because Almighty Al said so.
Well, and so at the time, sorry, this is a distraction. I just want to harp on bullshit from university system and teaching and all this stuff. And I'll tie this back into MMT. So in that class, I was taking a class called Surface Chemistry, which really analyzed how catalysts worked. And we opened up because this is the perfect class to talk about energy and global warming and how we have to stop the reliance on fossil fuels, because there was this big conversation of how we could use catalysts or surface chemistry at the very least to get to convert more of the chemical energy in oil to kinetic energy that moves your car forward. Because honestly, the amount of chemical energy, like say in the gallon of gas, about 20% of that actually turns into horizontal movement of your car. So part of the question was like, is there any way that we could turn this into like 30% or 40% or maybe even 50 or 60%? Which, is definitely an interesting question. But we got talking about, what are different ways that we can start getting energy from? And we talked about nuclear. And at the time, I was pretty anti-nuclear. I've changed a little bit on it, but I think this is still a good point. As I raised my hand and I said, look, I don't think nuclear is a good idea. And he goes, why? And I said, well, first of all, the depleted uranium gets sold to the military and they shoot it up all over countries, and that's not very good for the environment, is it? And his response was, yeah, well, that's political. That's a political problem. And you ever hear something so stupid that it shuts you up?
Yeah, it just did to me.
Where you're so dumbfounded, you're like, did this actually come out of the guy's mouth that is supposed to be this chemistry PhD that teaches, this like high level thinking? What? Like, as if all this global warming, carbon hysteria isn't...
Same guy who told you something about Al Gore, or who lectured you about Al Gore, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. This whole thing about Al Gore and global warming hysteria, this isn't political, but the fact that depleted uranium bullets get shot all over Iraq, it is. I was just... Couldn't squish my mind around.
It's all political.
It's all political. Anyway, so getting back to MMT and the idea of, are there the resources? Do we have the resources available in the economy to pay for something? And we look at something like teachers, and in this case, it's a professor, it's a university, but it's still. I went to a state university, and you brought up, well, I think we have enough. It's like, yeah, because when the way that the system is set up, you get this crap because they don't have to produce anything for their money. And I guess this is where the Austrian comes out in me, where it's like, look, just because the money system doesn't operate in the way that I thought it did, doesn't mean that people respond to incentives differently. And the fact that, this university system and the public educational system as a whole just gets funded this massive amounts of government money because, everybody needs good education. Everybody should have, equal access to this. And education is so important. It's so important. It just needs more money, more money, more money, more money. Well, you produce crap education. And
it's not like a teacher in a lecture hall are automatically a great thing.
Yes.
What if the teacher is a Marxist twat and fills up the lecture hall because students go in debt to listen to them to get a worthless degree? Where's the point in that? Where's the benefit in that society?
Well, why should this be paid for? How? Yeah, exactly. How is this a benefit? And then how is it not going to get worse if you just make it free for everybody to continue going to these places, so these Marxists get their infinite exploiting paychecks from the rest of society to regurgitate this insidious poison?
And you churn out people who are just obedient to authority, who just parrot what they've been told, who invent nothing new, who don't make scientific discoveries. That's what you get. How does that help us? I don't think it does.
I don't think it does either. So, again, we've said this before. We'll say it again. Just because we're MMTers does not mean we prescribe to the progressive version of it. So,
does not mean that we believe that the government should indoctrinate our kids or ourselves. As Warren Mosler said, what the government does is a political decision that you have to make. And then from there, you fund it through spending. But the first is a political choice, and then, the rest should follow from there. Should be no austerity. There should be no budget surplus when it's not needed, when the economy needs employment and growth, etc. So you can always separate political and economic matters in that manner.
Yes, sir. So let's finish this up. We got one more paragraph here. So, MMT and why you are about to hear a lot more of it. Much has been written about MMT of late. A lot of it has been dismissive, passing it off as a bad policy idea where deficits don't matter and a recipe for the next Zimbabwe. Anyone that has spent time reading any MMT academic literature will recognize these arguments carry very little weight, and most criticism has yet to challenge any of the core understandings that come with these decades of literature. This, in quotes, new idea is not going away anytime soon. Those who criticize it without detailed understanding and research may need to do some backtracking in the years ahead. Now they'll just double down. Peter Schiff. For those interested in reading more, I recommend the following, which is The 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy by Warren Mosler. Great book. Understanding Modern Money by Randall Wray. Good book, but a little rough. And Introduction to MMT Macroeconomics Textbook, 2019. That's brand new. Look at that. I have not read that one.
Yeah, I gotta check that out.
Cool. Well, that's a pretty good article.
Yeah.
I mean, the criticisms I had of it were nuanced and not really central to, what he was discussing. So I think he did great.
Right. I mean, he's just a guy who works in the money business and who needs to understand money. And so he writes about his findings. He's just an honest researcher. And that's usually the best kinds of articles.
Yep.
On the topic. Yeah.
Well, Nima, unless you have anything more to add.
Nope.
It's getting late for me and I want to go to bed. So with that, this has been Amagi. I am your co-host, Dylan Moore, with the Volitional Science Network, which you can find in YouTube. And that over there is Nima Majur of economicsjunkie.com. We are being graciously hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. And we will see you next time. Thank you for tuning in.